So in today's meeting of the seminar, I want us to cross the bridge from legal to social and political theory, to address the reimagination of the institutional structure of the contemporary societies and of the ideological assumptions with which their institutional arrangements are connected. And I intend to do that with respect to economic organization, the organization of the market economy, with respect to the state and the provision of public services, and with respect to the organization of democratic politics. Now, let me begin by posing the following question, presenting the following theme. We've discussed before the method of legal analysis in the exercise of its lesser vocation, which is the vocation of the professional elaboration of law in an adjudicative or quasi-adjudicative setting. And in that argument, I suggested that we would prefer a deflationary view, a view which retains the purposive approach to the interpretation of law, but abandons the effort at idealization and systematization, abandons the idea that each branch of law should be seen as a coherent system or as embarked on a journey toward the construction of such a system. And then this deflationary version of purposivism, if we could call it that, would be bounded on the lower side by equity and on the upper side by judicial statecraft. Now, the question that I now present is, how should we understand the method of legal thought, of legal analysis, in the exercise of its greater vocation? The greater vocation is to engage the structure of society and to assist the political parties, the social movements, the popular organizations in the reimagination and reformation of that structure. And of course, I leave open for the moment the question that has reappeared several times in our conversation of how it is that the jurists, given their narrow professional orientation, can come to be also the agents of such an expanded practice. In one of the writings that I think I assigned as background to the seminar, I once tried to characterize this method by the duo of mapping and criticism. That is, the idea is that in each branch of law and social practice, the part of social practice which that branch of law governs, the first move of this more ambitious idea of legal analysis would be to map the area without the preoccupation of forcing it into the Procrustean bed of a system, of an idealized system, but presenting it, in fact, as a tissue of contradictions. What we should expect to find in one branch of law after another is that there is a dominant method or a dominant paradigm, a dominant model of social life and of law in that branch of law. But this dominant method is surrounded by a host of exceptions, of anomalies. And the anomalies are of particular interest to us for the purpose of criticism and reconstruction, because they provide often in history in the history of political thought and in the history of practical politics, the material on which we can seize to develop an alternative. So frequently it happens that an alternative, at least conceptually, has its origin in a deviant model, in an anomaly within the existing branch of law. Now, take two areas of private law that we've mentioned before in our discussions. Property law and contract. And I remarked that in property law, or in the traditional conception that we have of property law, the central imaginative space is occupied by the unified, relatively absolute property right that was theorized in the 19th century. Property is a combination of powers, of distinct powers. In the civil law tradition, these powers are described as possession, usufruct. Usufruct is the claim to the income stream generated by the property, and alienation, the right to buy and sell. But there are many different ways of imagining how the unified property right could be, as it has been in history, cut up, disassembled, and allocated to fragmentary claimants or owners. Now, on the alternative practice suggested by this view of mapping and criticism, we would map without the concern, without the preconception of trying to force the anomalies into a peripheral and subordinate position. And we would imagine that the whole area of property, in the whole area of property, the anomalous forms of property, the fragmentary, disaggregated, disassembled forms of property could become the main thing. And then the idea of the unified property right, which had a central shaping role in the traditional law of property, would become, as it were, the limiting case rather than the standard case. A similar thing happens in contract law. So at the center, the imaginative space, is the bilateral executory promise, a fully articulated bargain for an exchange of performances at some moment in the future, with the understanding that the exchange is the aim of the contract, and then its execution fully exhausts the contract in an instantaneous moment of performance. But this idea of contract is also surrounded by a host of deviations, of anomalies that penetrate social life, of which perhaps the most important is the relational contract. The relational contract is a not fully articulated bargain, an incomplete contract or bargain for a series of performances in the future. And you could say that its real object is not so much those performances as the development of the relation itself and its fecundity, its potential to organize new exchanges in the future. So once again, instead of treating these anomalous forms of contract as just subordinate or peripheral, we could have an understanding of contract that treats them as the normal form of contract and the fully bargained out executory promise as the limiting case. That's just to provide a simple illustration of the potential of the exercise of mapping. the most important element in this first move of the method of moving, is simply the abandonment of the imaginative restraint that is imposed by the desire to pretend that there's a system, or that this set of contradictions between dominant and deviant solutions, in which most of law actually consists, is on the way to cohering into a system. Yes?
Pretty tactical question. You mentioned the civil law tradition of the property right,
Yes.
possession, use, for alienation.
Yes.
Would you distinguish that from the common law tradition?
Well, the common law just doesn't divide things up in that way. And in the common law, of course, specifically with the law of property, the old English law of property was already highly complex and disaggregated, already foresaw a wide range of partial rights. So it never achieved or expressed the simple systematic idea that was fully developed in 19th century civil law. Now, there is at least one discipline, non-legal discipline, in which the practitioners of the discipline seem to imagine that that was the law, and that's economics. Because, as I've said, half facetiously, the practical economist still thinks, and has always thought, that a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. And is either not aware of these complications of historical experience or not interested in them.
And would you put, like, for example, the right to exclude, things like notions like that, in the bucket of possession within civil law? Is that just like a...
Well, that's a technical doctrinal question. You have to go into the details. So actually, this idea that the three powers are possession, usufruct, and alienation is a radical simplification, because there are many different ways of cutting it up. So look at contemporary financial markets, which are markets in derivatives, and people don't realize that the reason why they're called derivatives is the technical legal reason that they are derivative, fragmentary forms of the unified property right. And so a market is established in some fragment of this right, some temporary form, some conditional form, and that's what financial derivatives are. So this scandalous idea of the disaggregation of property rights is, in fact, every day, the technical assumption of the financial markets. Now, sometimes this idea that property is just a bundle of rights or a bundle of powers, and that it can be disaggregated in any number of ways, and in legal history has been disaggregated, as a matter of fact, in many different ways, is mischaracterized. It's misrepresented, as if it were the idea that property has no structure at all. And that's not the idea. The idea is not that there's no structure, that's arbitrary. For example, in the United States, there's an academic movement, a movement in the legal academy called the New Doctrinalism, or the New Private Law, which tries to resurrect this old idea of doctrine of legal dogmatics. And among the things that its authors or participants say is this, that it's a mistake that property has a structure, but no one ever claimed that property has no structure. The point is it has many structures. It has particular structures, but alternative structures. So that would be the first move. We do this mapping in which we release ourselves from the chains of this preconception that it is a system or that it is evolving in the direction of a system. And then the second moment is the moment of criticism. So in the moment of criticism, we say, given a certain understanding of our interests and ideals, of the interests and ideals that are expressed in part of law, we tinker with some of the arrangements expressed in law, expressed legally, for the sake of realizing the ideals or the interests more fully. So, and the background of this idea is the conception of what law is that we have from the German historicists, from Hegel, and from the historical school. The conception is, what is law? Law is the institutional form of the life of a people. Described or represented in relation to the understandings of interests and of ideals that are supposed to make sense of it. That's what law is. So our interests and ideals, or our understanding of our interests and ideals, is always nailed to the cross of the institutions and practices that represent them in fact. And law is the site of this crucifixion. That's, in a formula, the historical idea, the idea of the historicist, the Hegelian idea of law, which is being presupposed in this description that I'm now giving you of the second move of the method, the move of criticism. So we say, given this understanding that it's not just a bunch of rules, it's the connection between the detailed institutional arrangements and the representation of interests and ideals that make sense of them. How do we proceed when we're trying to reimagine or reconstruct? We say there's a contradiction between some aspect of the way we understand our interests or ideals and the present arrangements. So then we tinker with the arrangements for the sake of realizing the interests or ideals more fully. And when we do that, we characteristically discover that the tinkering results in the revelation of an ambiguity in our understanding of the interests or ideals, which was previously hidden to us. So, what is important about property, for example, is what is important, the amount of absolute decentralization, or is it the absoluteness of the control that each of the agent has over the resources at his command? We begin to tinker and we discover that there's a choice to be made between two directions. And the position we take depends on how we understand the ambiguity. So long as we weren't tinkering with the practical arrangements, the ambiguity in our understanding of interests or ideals was not manifest. But it becomes manifest when we put pressure against the detailed structure. That's the way in which it works. So you could describe this method as a kind of method of internal development. We revise the practical arrangements expressed in law for the sake of a certain way of understanding our interests and ideals. And when we do that, we discover an ambiguity in our understanding of our interests and ideals. And then we resolve that ambiguity in one way or another. And we go back and forth between the representational element and the practical or institutional element. Now, of course, that method of internal development is not a perpetual motion machine. It's not closed. It's not the only thing in moral and political argument, because there's another element, which is what comes from the outside, the visionary or prophetic element in political argument, which then appeals to something which is altogether outside of this experience of comparing institutions to received understandings and received understandings to institutions. And so I think in any adequate account of criticism and transformation has to take that external element in view, into account. And what does the prophet do? The prophet, the political prophet, has some vision of unrealized human opportunity. And he then has to present a down payment on that future that he envisions, some fragmentary form accessible or expressed in present experience, which is, as it were, a foretaste of the future that he imagines. So then, to change the world, we have to begin from what we have, right? And in law, what we have are these variations and contradictions in the present form of law, which the idealizing and systematizing view urged on us by rationalizing legal analysis suppresses. So I said before, we abandon the attempt to suppress it in that way, and we open ourselves to the lessons of the contradictions. Now that's precisely the exercise that I want to go through with respect to the organization of the market order, the organization of democratic politics, and the organization of civil society outside the market and the state, in order to illustrate how this larger vocation of legal thought, which I described, can be performed. But then, of course, we can always ask, performed by whom? And that's our question of agency. And performed for whom? That's the question of the constituency of this alternatives. And finally, there's the question of what's the direction? So I want to look at this from the standpoint of someone who thinks of himself as a progressive or a leftist. And therefore, the first order of business is to redefine what the term leftist or progressive means. What is the direction from which we would consider in this exercise of mapping and criticism the direction to take? Now, these are matters about which I've thought and written a great deal, and what I want to do now is simply for the purposes of organizing our discussion, simplify radically. So, what is the conventional ideological debate as we have inherited it from the past? The debate between the right and left, between the conservative and the progressive. It is a debate between what you would call shallow freedom and shallow equality. So on this version of the ideological conflict, who is a conservative or who is the right? The right and the conservatives are the people who accord priority to the ideal of freedom against the background of the established institutional arrangements, especially the established arrangements of the market and of democracy. And the left, who is the left? The left are those who accord priority to the ideal of equality against the same background. And that's why I'm calling this an understanding of the ideological conflict that pits shallow equality against shallow freedom. And this is clearly expressed in the most influential theories of justice, especially now in the English-speaking world, like the Rawlsian theory of justice. So these theories, on their face, seem to be radically egalitarian. The ultimate concern is redistribution for the sake of equality, and especially to the benefit of the most worst off, the worst off. But they combine with this egalitarianism institutional conservatism or skepticism. That is, the equality they want to achieve is an equality achieved largely by compensatory redistribution through progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. So the underlying idea is the market is a tremendous machine for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, the market also generates inequality. So we won't prevent it from creating the wealth that it creates. We'll let it work its magic of wealth creation, but we'll come afterwards and we'll fix the results through progressive taxation or compensatory redistribution, compensatory social spending. Now, this opens up a host of practical problems because overwhelmingly actual inequality is shaped by the primary distribution, not by what you do afterwards. That is, if the market creates a certain distribution of economic and educational advantage, that distribution is what has overwhelming influence. Can you come afterwards and take it all back? So if the market does one thing and then you say, no, it doesn't matter how unequal it is, we'll fix it later. Can you do that? And so it seems that you can't really do that because if the inequalities are massive, if they're anchored in the structure of production, for example, in the abyss between the advanced and backward parts of production, you can't cancel it out without undermining the established arrangements for production and exchange and subverting the established incentives to invest, to work, and to employ. You can't take it all back. You can attenuate it, but you can't take it all back. So then these theories in practice, like these Anglo-American theories of justice, end up being a kind of philosophical or pseudo-philosophical prop to the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. So they seem to be radically egalitarian, but in context What they really are is a justification of this compensatory redistribution as far as it goes. They theorize they could go much further, but apparently it can't go much further, or it doesn't go much further. Now, what would be an alternative view of the distinction between the right and the left, the conservative and the progressive? The beginning of an alternative view is suggested to us by how the contrast was understood in the past, in the first half of the 19th century, by people like John Stuart Mill or Karl Marx, by both the liberals and the socialists. It was understood in a different way. The aim was not a radical equality of outcome. The aim was not to be something like the ancient model, the model of ancient Sparta or ancient Rome, mythical model. The Romans were all equal and they were all poor. That was not the model. The model was, the central idea was to lift up the life of the ordinary man and woman to a higher level of intensity, of scope, of capability. And we could, in a formula, express it in this way, to say, the aim of the progressives never was to humanize society. The aim was to divinize humanity and to make the ordinary man and woman more human by making them more godlike, by increasing their power, by increasing their share in the divine attribute of transcendence. So we could reimagine the distinction between the progressive and the conservative to take account of these concerns. And we could imagine them as organized on two main criteria. Criteria about the aim and criteria about the method or the practice. So let's start with the criterion about the method or the practice. Who are the progressives, or what is the left? The leftists, the progressives, are those who refuse to take the established institutional arrangements as the unsurpassable horizon of their political projects, but want their objectives to be realized even at the cost of the transformation of the structure of the arrangements, the institutional arrangements of the market or the institutional arrangements of the state and of democracy. And who are the conservatives? The conservatives are the ones who do take the established regime, the regime being a combination of institutions and ideology or consciousness, as the horizon. That's the difference in the practice. And what's the difference in the goal? The conservatives or the right are those who think that it's natural for human life to be small. That there's an elite of heroes, entrepreneurs, adventurers, geniuses who are released from this fate of belittlement. But the mass of men and women are consigned to this fate, except when there is some great crisis or emergency, like war, which then takes them out of the long littleness of life and gives them an alternative. So like Pierre, the protagonist of Tolstoy's War and Peace, start of the novel, sees Halley's Comet in the sky. And Halley's Comet is a presage of this great revolution that will tear everyone out of the long littleness of life. And then they'll be released. And that's what's normal on this conservative view. Now, the leftist or the progressive is the one who thinks it's not normal for human life to be small. And the ordinary man and woman can ascend to a higher level of life with greater scope, with more intensity, with an enhancement of the experience of agency, which is the experience of turning the tables against the established context, provided that we ascend together. And that's the essence of the progressive view. And in that view, the aim of equality is important, but it's subsidiary to the aim of greatness, shared greatness. And that's what makes a progressive a progressive. It's not this focus on this envious, invidious focus on a rigid equality of outcome or circumstance, in which, on this view, the leftists would say, no one is really interested, no one wants that. What we want is to be released from our indignity and to have access to a larger life. That's the conception of the contrast presupposed by what I'm going to say next. Yes?
Would you say that this is similar to the differentiation that Isaiah Berlin makes between negative and positive liberty?
I don't think this is the same thing of that thing. I think that that distinction between negative and, I think the negative is always more important than the positive. But that distinction could be applied by both the conservative and the progressive in this view. What do you think? What's your understanding?
Because when you were talking about the progressive view as the elevation of...
Yeah, so for example, Nietzsche
Yeah.
is a clear expression of this idea. There's an elite of heroes, of innovators, of disruptors. So the disruptors are the salt of the earth. They're the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. But most of humanity cannot share in this epiphany, in this narrative of emancipation, of disruption. That's what's in contention, whether we can share in it or not. So obviously an entrenched and extreme inequality is inimical to this emancipation. But it's subsidiary. It's not the main thing. The main narrative is about something else. And that's the claim.
Yeah, when you were talking about that kind of like the progressive view, it reminded me of like Isaiah Berlin also talks about the tradition of talking about positive liberty as self-actualization, as if that there are certain ideals that humans embody, and the goal is for humanity to be free by actualizing those ideals. And he says that this usually leads to...
Well, if you could put this in a theological language, I don't know about Isaiah Berlin, because Isaiah Berlin was an institutionally conservative social democrat, despite this vocabulary of positive and negative freedom. But so in the theological language, you would say the human being can increase his quota in this attribute of transcendence. Not omnipotence, not omniscience, not power. It's not triumphalism, but it's this faculty of being more than he seems to be in his context. And that's how we become more human. That's how we become us. We become us by expressing and exercising this power of transcendence. Everything in our existence points beyond itself. Huh? And how can we organize, how can we conduct our lives and organize our societies in such a way that they recognize this central feature of our existence, which is this vocation to go beyond. Huh? That's the central point. Yes.
Can you help provide structure for the distinction between contemporary notions of equity and this concept of progressive equality here?
Well, the contemporary notions expressed in the theories of justice, that's why I cited them, are conservative. So in this contrast that I proposed between how to rethink the contrast between right and left, the theoreticians of justice, despite their egalitarianism, are on the side of the right. They're conservatives because their work is not about the transformation of structure. Their work is about the humanization of the existing structure. And they don't have this belief in that we can ascend. Some of them, including Berlin, might regard this as romanticism. But I think the problem, now, there's another important conceptual clarification that regards the other criterion of distinction between right and left, which is whether you take the established regime as the horizon. The complication is the complication induced by Marxism. Because for Marxism, the change of the regime is a systemic change. Remember the illusions of false necessity. One of them is the regimes are indivisible. Therefore, our idea of politics is a binary idea. All politics is either the reformist management of a regime or the revolutionary substitution of one regime by another. And I'm, of course, rejecting that in this way of formulating the contrast between right and left, because I'm saying that structural change, when it really occurs in history, is almost inevitably piecemeal and has this ambiguity, that every piecemeal change can serve as a pretext not to take the next step, or it can be the move toward the next step, and that's the way things are. That's real structural change, as opposed to this fantasy of total change. The idea of total change, the idea of revolutionary change in the real world is now mainly an alibi for its opposite. So the disenchanted social democrat thinks what would be real change, revolutionary change, that would be change of everything. The substitution of capitalism by socialism, even though they don't know how to define socialism, because the state control of the economy is no longer the accepted idea of socialism. So what's left to do? So it's not accessible, this total change. If it were accessible, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do is to humanize the world. And that's what this disenchanted social democrat does. He says, I'll occupy power and I'll make things better. But there'll be no structural program. The structural program is this fantasy of total change. And so then it becomes a pretext for resignation. So through this highly simplified argument, I'm invoking another idea of transformation. Real transformation is fragmentary, piecemeal, ambiguous in the way I described, dangerous. Whitehead again, the business of the future is to be dangerous. It can go off the rails at any moment, but that's what it's really like.
In this imagination, like what constitutes structural change? I'm just like, can you provide examples?
So let's go back to the premise of classical social theory, that there are the surface routines and conflicts of society are shaped by a regime of basic institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions. And this regime controls the surface conflicts and routines, but what it chiefly controls are the routines that have to do with the way in which we create the future within the present. That is the conflict over the crucial society-making resources of economic capital, political power, and cultural authority. So it's not flat, it's not unidimensional, there's a depth, there's a deep structure. And how do we know we've changed this deep structure? We know we've changed it when we've changed some of the routines at the surface about this making of the future. So, for example, take Keynesianism. Keynesianism is an example of piecemeal structural change. If you understand it not just as a set of policies, but as a set of assumptions or ideas. So before Keynesianism, there was the gold standard. And what was the role of the gold standard? The role of the gold standard is described, for example, by the Polish Marxist economist Kalecki, was to make the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence. So if confidence was withdrawn, if there was a capital strike in effect, money would flow out and there would be a big economic crisis. The level of economic activity would fall into depression. So Keynesianism was a set of ideas and practices, including later counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policy, which released this constraint and served then as the basis for the new form of the political business cycle. So there is still a cycle under Keynesianism, but it's a cycle that is different from the cycle that prevailed under the gold standard. And that's how we know we've made a structural change. We know we've made a structural change when the nature of the crucial conflicts over these resources by which we make the future changes. That's the definition of a structural change. And I'm describing it by using Keynesianism as an example, and speaking as an opponent or a critic of Keynesianism. I can say it's to distinguish this idea of structural change between any kind of idealization. It's not an idealization. Keynes deliberately opted for a method of intervention that would fix demand, purchasing power, rather than change, for example, the control over the investment decision, because he didn't want to be mistaken for a fellow traveler of some kind of socialism. But nevertheless, it's a fragmentary structural change.
So the emergence of neoliberalism, would you also characterize that as structural in the sense that it fundamentally changed the relationship?
Yes, so fundamentally, yeah, it changed the relation between market and state. How fundamentally is a question of dispute. So you can put it this way. The last major institutional and ideological settlement in the West was historical social democracy. Its counterpart in the United States was Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Historical social democracy was attacked by neoliberalism as being both inefficient and unfair. Unfair because it established distinctions between insiders and outsiders. Between, for example, the relatively tenured labor force in the capital-intensive parts of the economy and the precarious workers in the secondary labor market. But above all, what's most important is that conventional historical social democracy had a basis in a form of production, which was for this mass production. Historical social democracy was a project for a world in which workers were assembled in large productive, could be organized because they were assembled in large productive units like factories under the aegis of large corporate entities. That world began to vanish in the closing decades of the 20th century. So the main reason why social democracy failed or was eviscerated was the crisis of its basis in production. But neoliberalism acted as the ally, the political ally of this real historical force in the evisceration of historical social democracy. Social democracy then abandoned its elaborate distinctions between insiders and outsiders, not just workers, but corporate insiders and corporate outsiders, for example, the market and corporate control, which one of the characteristics of historical social democracy was the defense of incumbents against challengers. It abandoned all of that, and under the pressure of this crisis in the form of production and of this neoliberal attack, it then retreated to the last line of defense. The last line of defense is the maintenance of a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed by the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption. That's what we have in Europe today. And what resulted from that partial hollowing out of historical social democracy was what you could call social liberalism. So social liberalism is the regime that has the best form to be considered the hegemonic project in the West. There's the project in the West of the governing elites, if you put aside the plutocratic populism that has appeared on the scene. The hegemonic project is to combine the economic flexibility of the Americans with the social protection of the Europeans within a barely adjusted version of the inherited institutional framework. That's the hegemonic project. Because the right of center and the left of center parties have been unable to solve or even address the main structural problems of these societies, of productivity, of growth, of cohesion, and of change, plutocratic populism has appeared on the scene as the uninvited visitor and stepped into this vacuum, and it complicated the picture. So I would say the crucial concepts here are historical social democracy, which is the point of departure, neoliberalism, which was the attack allied with the change in the form of production, and now social liberalism, which is the practical outcome, the hegemonic outcome, the dominant political economy. That's how I would present it. And it's a complication because it's common to think that neoliberalism is hegemonic, but neoliberalism is really mainly an attack. Insofar as it had a positive doctrine, the positive doctrine of neoliberalism was market fundamentalism, like Hayek's economics. And Hayek's economics is easy to attack, right, and not realistic. And I characterized it in an earlier class half facetiously by saying if Robinson Crusoe traded long enough on his island, he would eventually reproduce the whole system of German private law. So it's the idea that implicit in market exchange is a particular organization of the market. So now let me present one further subject before we turn to the content. Who is this for? What is the agent? So, in the leftist theories of the 19th and 20th century, the crucial agent was the industrial working class. And today we'd say, well, there was conventional industry for this mass production. It's in crisis all over the world. It's no longer the most advanced practice of production. There's a new practice of production, which we call the innovative or knowledge economy, and it appears as a set of fringes that exclude the vast majority of workers and business. It's the insular knowledge economy. And we're accustomed to think that the crucial constituent for the alternative is the industrial working class. But the industrial working class now is perceived by all the other classes in society and ultimately comes to perceive itself as just one more special interest, clamoring for protection against, for example, deindustrialization, against plant closings, against offshoring, and not as the bearer of the universal interests of humanity. So, what is the problem in the world? What is the most important constituent? It's not this elite industrial working class shrinking and self-interested. In most of the large populous countries of the world, most people are poor. They continue to be poor and disorganized. But their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. So, all over the world, in the vast majority of societies, what is the aspiration of the ordinary man and woman? The aspiration is to have a little plot of land, a small farm, a shop, a store, or some technical service for which they can charge a fee. So the aspiration is petty bourgeois, not proletarian. So the people are poor. The people are not small business class. The people are not members of the petty bourgeoisie in Bolsonaro or Lula's Brazil or in Modi's India. The people are continue to be poor, the vast majority, but their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois. And this is what you could call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. Objectively, they're not petty bourgeois, but subjectively, they are. And so what do they want? They want traditional, archaic, retrograde family business, traditionally based on self-exploitation and family saving, and inconsistent with a socially inclusive dynamic of rising productivity. Now, how can there be a growth miracle? How do growth miracles happen in modern history? They happen by a combination of two movements. There has to be a fracture in the elite, in the national elite. The elites are generally colonial, neo-colonial, they're made of rentiers, and there has to form a dissident elite, which has a productivist and nationalist orientation. And this dissident elite then has to garner support among the people. Today, they would have to garner support among this subjective petty bourgeoisie. And they would have to win it over from its default aspiration, its default petty bourgeoisie aspiration, to a productivist project. Because retrograde, isolated family business is not a solution for the individual. really a reliable solution. It's just a paste over, a make work. But much less is it a solution for the country if the country is to be involved, engaged in a growth miracle and in an economic ascent. And this has to be done now under the new conditions of this insular knowledge economy, because that's now, and not mass production, the advanced practice of production. Mass production survives as the vestige of an earlier vanguard or as a satellite to the new vanguard. So the people who are in control of the new vanguard have found a way to bifurcate the process of production into two parts. The creative and lucrative core they keep for themselves, and the routinized or commoditized part they subcontract to workers and businesses in remote parts of the world with much lower wage and much lower tax and labor arbitrage. So the question is, what are these who are these alternatives for, going back to my original question? These alternatives are for the developing countries or the nations of the world wanting to go through these growth miracles, and they're specifically for this majority of poor people with petty bourgeois aspirations. And they require that the petty bourgeois default solution be replaced by something else, by some dynamic of increasing productivity, which the counter elite would have to organize to the benefit of the nation. Now, those are all very consequential claims that I've made, so let me pause and ask for your comments. So I made now two sets of claims, right, before getting into the content. One is, how should we think of the distinction between conservative and progressive, right and left? And I've taken a particular position. I've said, the current distinction doesn't make sense. But that doesn't mean that we should simply abandon the contrast between right and left. We should reinvent it. Even though the reinvention produces some anomalies, because on my proposed conception of right and left, most of the people who today are labeled leftists are rightists. These institutionally conservative social democrats or social liberals. And then I've had a second set of ideas about the crucial constituency. So Karl Marx, who's had the greatest influence on the development of the ideas and politics of the left, thought that the industrial labor working class was the most plausible agent of the universal interests of humanity. I think it's no longer plausible, and it's not considered plausible by the other classes. It's a shrinking part and a special interest. It too has a task. The task is, instead of just trying to buy a few more years for these Rust Belt industries, it would have to find allies in the nation in order to convert declining mass production industry into a variant of the knowledge economy. And in that task, the groups that it used to define as its enemies or rivals, like the foreign workers or the small business class or the temporary workers, would have to become its allies. The crucial constituency, however, is in another place. The crucial constituency is this majority of poor people with a petty bourgeois horizon. Now, comments, remarks about this second thesis?
what do you do when that mass, like the masses themselves, that the core crucial constituency are themselves institutionally conservative, right? Like, I mean, maybe it's just my experience being in the United States, right? But if people.
So
right, if-
one question, by the way, is what's the counterpart in the rich countries, in the rich North Atlantic countries, to this narrative that I just gave of the poor majority with the petty bourgeoisie, the subjective petty bourgeoisie? Is there a subjective petty bourgeoisie in the United States? That is, so they're not poor, so the majority is not poor, but at the same time they are or they feel disempowered. So the question is, how should we understand the counterpart in the rich countries to this story I just told about the rest of the world? And what's the answer to that question?
I don't
Because
know.
obviously we know that they feel disempowered or disenfranchised from the result. Otherwise, why did they elect? Why did they spurn the conventional parties and elect the plutocratic populists who spoke to their disenfranchisement, to their abandonment, and so forth? So there's some parallelism there, right?
Yes, and it's interesting because I'm not sure the extent to which I was talking to some friends with, like, how often Americans are voting with their interests as opposed to their emotions and frustrations, and right, like if you, I don't know, right, like there's this anger.
Well, there's no
that-
simple opposition between those two things, right? I mean, the white working class majority of the United States could, with some justification, view itself to be the victim of a conspiracy between the black leadership, the white leadership, right? Things like affirmative action, things like the constitutional entrenchment of their moral agenda against,
Free
because,
trade.
because they could say, look, these people, like the Democratic Party, have done nothing for us economically. At least let's not let them attack our religious and moral views. I don't think I wouldn't call that acting on the basis of their emotions. That would be a cold, calculating view of their interests.
Yes, I guess, I mean that, like, today, some of the, like, the loud, outspoken fringe left and their sort of discontent with the current president and the apparent willingness to spurn that in favor of the plutocratic
But there's a
coming back,
confusion, right?
Like,
What is the fringe left? Who is the fringe left? I mean, what you're calling the fringe left, doesn't it simply propose the radicalization of compensatory redistribution? Things like progressive taxation? What do they want? To increase the rate of the progressive income tax? We know that the progressive income tax is almost irrelevant. Rich people don't pay income tax in the United States or anywhere in the world. The income tax is a tax on the wages of the middle class. Is that what they propose?
yes, I guess I was, in saying that, I was reverting to sort of how, sort of not your model of right versus left, but how,
But their redistributivist model of,
yes, and I guess I just don't, I have trouble making sense or like having some form of.
well, take this thing, this problem, which I have discussed in some of the other courses I'm teaching this semester. So compare the United States and Europe with respect to equalization, redistributive equalization, right? On paper, the American tax system is the most equal among the rich industrial democracies because it's the one that gives a central role to the progressive taxation of personal income. The European social democracies, which we know are much more equal than the United States, base their tax systems on the regressive and indirect taxation of consumption through the VAT, the value-added tax, or some functional equivalent to it, like in France. So how can you explain that the most unequal society is the one that has the most progressive tax system, and the more equal ones has the more regressive tax system? I think that there's a very simple explanation, but which is not given to the people, right? In the short term, first of all, structural change trumps compensatory redistribution. Everything that you can do to influence the primary distribution of advantage and opportunity is much more important than anything that you can do after the fact to correct it. But the second thing is that with respect to the budget, what matters in the short term is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. So the simple reason why the budget is more egalitarian in Europe than in the United States is that the Europeans take in at least 10% of GDP more as tax take, and then they spend it redistributively. Now, why are they able to take in more than the United States? For an economic reason, that the VAT is conceptually the most neutral possible tax. It's a tax which takes a constant proportion of the transformation of every input into an output. And it therefore allows you to maximize the tax take while minimizing the economic disruption caused by taxation. That's why they're able to take in more taxes. Now, the American politicians must know that progressive redistributive taxation, especially the income tax, is insignificant. It has almost no impact. So why are they pretending at election time that more redistribution through progressive taxation is one of their main solutions? It seems to be some symbolic act. They want to show on whose side they are. And they're preferring progressive pieties to transformative effects. So in this comparison of the United States to Europe to the rest of the world, a complication is the element of confusion, of illusion. The actual causal relations are obscure to the elites, but especially to the people. Otherwise, how can you make sense of this story that I just told? What's the explanation?
Well, that's just it, right? Like, I think it's extremely difficult to try to make sense of political conflict and political life in the same way that the enterprise of retrospective rationalization of law is potentially foolish and problematic. For example, I don't know how sensible it is for the American left, as I'm right, to in their frustration with the governing elite of the party that purports to represent the left, to withdraw or express such disfavor that they're willing to enable the plutocratic populace to come back, which seems to be what's going to happen. And like that to me is a conundrum that's irreconcilable.
Why are they doing that? Well, they haven't done it yet, right? But
Right.
it's not what I'm saying is that there's a way of understanding this which makes it appear not as irrational as you're making it out to be. Because the premise of all of this is that the right of center and the left of center parties have no solution and haven't done anything for the majority. Therefore, let's try and get out of this with at least the least harm possible to other things, like, for example, their religion, their moral beliefs, and so forth. But all of this, the way in which this bears on our conversation here, is all of this makes it all the more important that there be alternatives. And there can't be alternatives in politics until they exist in someone's mind. They're not automatic. They don't appear on the scene automatically. It's like the story about Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a radical experimentalist. He said, I'll try anything. He said that explicitly. And he opened himself to a wide range of voices. But now you look at the content of the early institutional experimentalism of the New Deal, and what you find is that it was totally dominated by restabilization, corporatism, the state as the employer of last resort, and in detail, it was very close to the policies of Mussolini and of Hitler in the early years. Now, why, if Roosevelt was such a radical experimentalist, why did he end up doing the same thing that they were doing on the other side of the Atlantic? Because the ideas don't appear when you want them to appear. The range of institutional ideas available at any given moment in history is relatively inelastic. The politicians often think that the only problem are opposing interests. But actually, that's not the first problem. The first problem is the content. So it's like in King Lear, you say, you can call the spirits, but will they come? They won't come, just because you want them to come. So this is then the justification for the focus on the intellectual, the doctrinal element in the formulation of alternatives. The ideas have to come from somewhere. One of the theses here of this conversation in the seminar is, in this missing conversation, law has an intellectual advantage, which is the level of detail at which it operates. And it has its hands on the detail. And any alternative we have to create out of this mass of legal and institutional detail.
But isn't it the result of a undetailed and amorphous political contest? Right? Like, law is emerging.
Of course, there has to be a national struggle,
Yeah.
a national debate, but someone has to have clarity, right? I mean, because it's a very common premise of the leftists in the world is they want to seem to be concealing for tactical reasons a plan that they in fact don't have, right? But you don't have a plan unless it can live in many minds, unless it can be discussed, unless it can be debated. And so in this set of equivocations which I've been describing, someone has to be clear-sighted. And then I think that any discourse which is sufficiently powerful can eventually find a way to be understood by everyone. There's no truth that is too complicated for ordinary humanity to understand. But so that's the role of enlightenment in this story. Now, just give me 2 minutes. I'll be right back. So can we turn then to the first subject, substantive subject, which is the reorganization of the market order in the age of the insular knowledge economy, against the background of these ideas about the distinction between right and left, and about the constituency, the crucial constituency of transformation. So my assumption, my picture is there's a new vanguard of production. In every historical period, there is a most advanced practice of production. The most advanced practice of production is not necessarily, when it first emerges, the most efficient, the one that produces the most output with the fewest inputs. The most advanced practice of production is the exemplary practice. It's the practice with the greatest potential to reach the frontier of productivity, to remain at it, and to inspire the transformation of the entire economy. That practice of production, that most advanced practice of production, used to be conventional industry. And development economics, the economics of development for all but the richest countries, had a message. The message was, there's a shortcut to economic growth. The shortcut is to take workers and resources out of the less productive sectors of production and to put them in the most productive sectors. Meaning, in practice, take them out of agriculture and put them in industry. And the qualification in this message of development economics was the shortcut works against the background of the fundamentals. So you can advance rapidly toward what they call unconditional convergence to prosperity, to the situation of the richer countries. But eventually you'll hit against a constraint imposed by institutions and by education. But the constraint was in fact very lax. For example, education. There's lip service paid to education, but the reality is that in the age of mass production, the worker didn't need to be educated. All the worker needed to have was elementary literacy or numeracy, so he could understand verbal or numerical instructions, a disposition to obey, and rudimentary manual dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination. And so mass production was a stereotype kit of a small repertoire of machines and capabilities. It's as if you could put it in a plane and take it from one place to another. Very easy. And then you could have this shortcut to growth. And now, so this was the large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes, semi-skilled labor, and very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. That was the world of mass production. And that was a world in which workers could be assembled, a stable labor force in large productive units, factories under the aegis of corporations, and there were these stable, relatively well-paying jobs. That world is disappearing, and that's the ultimate basis of the crisis of social democracy. Its basis in the production, in the reality of production is being destroyed. And what emerges then is the knowledge economy, which should not be identified solely with advanced manufacture, and much less with the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. In fact, the platform oligopolies represent an anomaly within the knowledge economy based on a very specific set of enabling circumstances. Like, for example, the entirely contingent and surprising fact that there is a lacuna, a gap in the law of intellectual property, which makes it possible for these firms to do business in an unremunerated good, which is the information of their customers, which the law doesn't protect. And that's the basis of their business. And and they can press a button and add one more customer to their universal platforms at no cost, near zero marginal cost, and so forth. So it's an exception. The knowledge economy exists in every part of production, in intellectually dense services, as well as in precision or scientific agriculture. In fact, one of the characteristics of the age of the knowledge economy is that the distinction among sectors of production is effaced, is relativized. So for example, advanced manufacture consists in large part in crystallized and combined intellectual services. The distinction between services and manufacture is undermined. But although the knowledge economy is multi-sectoral, in every sector it appears as an exclusive fringe or an archipelago of islands that exclude the vast preponderance of workers and of businesses. So just to exaggerate the situation in the United States and in many of these other societies. A small minority is in command of the commanding heights of the knowledge economy. The businesses with the largest market capitalization now in the United States are these platform oligopolies. The people who are in control of these firms at the heights of the knowledge are surrounded by a penumbra of paper pushers who serve them. Management consultants, financiers, tax accountants, estate planners, and so forth. Everyone else in the society is abandoned to what is essentially some form of make-work. So that's then the description. That's also the background to this political disturbance that we were discussing. So the most important productivist project for the society would be the transformation of this knowledge economy for the few into a knowledge economy for the many. The replacement of a socially exclusive vanguardism by a socially inclusive vanguardism. How is that to be done? Is then the question. And the key analytical premise is that a market order has no single natural and necessary form, premise that we've discussed many times before in our conversations. And the first way in which to defend that thesis is to take the idea of the market up to the most abstract level. At the most abstract level, a market has at least two dimensions. And one dimension is the absolute level of decentralization, meaning the number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the second dimension is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at their command. Is the control conditional? Is it limited in some way? Is it perpetual? Can they transmit it through the hereditary transmission of property and so forth? Now, the key claim of market fundamentalism or neoliberalism is that these two dimensions of the market idea go naturally and necessarily together. But the truth is exactly the opposite. Not only do they not go naturally and necessarily together, but it's quite obvious that they contradict each other. Because one of the ways in which you could extend the degree of absolute decentralization is to relativize or qualify or make temporary the absolute control. Or take a simple idea like time sharing of a good. Say, it's not one person owns it for the whole year, another person, the others don't own it, but you'll share the control in some way. So that then is the invitation to rethink the institutional context of productive activity. Now, how can you imagine a trajectory of legal and institutional transformation that would go in the direction of creating an inclusive knowledge economy? Little by little, step by step, beginning piecemeal. In the first stage, the emphasis would be on uplift of the periphery, all the people who are consigned to the make work. And there are two main addressees or beneficiaries of this uplift operation. The small and medium-sized firms of the backward economy, not the high-tech startups but the ordinary firms. And the second are the mass of autonomous economic agents who have no stable relation to any business organization, which is now a major part of every contemporary economy. Like, for example, nurse practitioners or machine repair technicians. So their capabilities, their economic potential has to be lifted up. And this would be a 21st century equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension. And this, remember, we discussed this before, this happened once before in American history. The Americans in the early 19th century organized a family scale farming with entrepreneurial attributes, which was the most efficient system of agriculture that had existed in the world up to that point. And they did this distributing the land on the agrarian frontier, bringing agronomic science to the door of the family farmer, from the land-grant colleges right there to the production site, promoting cooperative competition among the farmers, and having this decentralized partnership between the government and the family farmer. That was an uplift operation, and this would have to be done again. There are states in the world that have many of the organizations useful to this exercise, like Germany and Brazil has it, national development banks, consultancies for small and medium-sized businesses, networks of vocational schools. They could be the instruments of an advanced form of practical training, emphasizing higher order conceptual and manual capabilities needed for the continuous reprogramming of the numerically controlled machine tools on which the knowledge economy depends. So that would be part of the first step, you could say. And that's a national project which requires partnership between the state and the firms. It would probably require innovations in American administrative law to allow for the construction of these decentralized support centers that would be governmental or para-state and partnering with the producers. And we have to have a financial basis, some kind of development funds or banks of some kind. And someone would have to orchestrate the relation to credit, the relation to knowledge and capability, which is what the private venture capitalist does in his own business. And then we have to find out empirically or experimentally what works to identify the successful practices, experimentally, and then to disseminate them. Now, a second part of the task at this first stage is to influence the evolution of technology. Technology has no intrinsic logic of evolution. It has the evolutionary logic that we give it. It always replaces labor to some extent, but it can also, as it replaces labor, empower labor at the same time. So how should we think about technology? There are two ways of thinking about technology. In one way, technology is about the materialization of the channel between our experiments in the mobilization of natural forces to our benefit, like electricity, and our experiments in the organization of cooperation. Technology is about that. It's about the relation between these two sets of experiments. Another way to think about technology is about the frontier between what we have learned how to repeat and what we have not yet learned how to repeat. So everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm, and then we can embody the algorithm or the formula in the mechanical device, the machine. And viewed from this angle, the point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, our time, for what we have not yet learned how to repeat. And then the partnership between the algorithmic machine and the human being with imagination becomes much more powerful than either of them alone. And so the state can intervene to influence the development of technology, to repackage these technologies in a form that renders them susceptible to assimilation according to the movable capacity of assimilation, the learning frontier of these small and medium-sized firms or these autonomous economic agents. So I gave the example of the machine technician or the nurse practitioner. We transform them into technologically equipped artisans through this effort at uplift. And that requires a very different kind of education, general education and practical training, the kind that we have, yes.
What do you make of sort of the classic economic inequality literature on the race between technology and education? Like education is as sort of a proxy for labor power, right? Is constantly.
But you mean
battle.
the different kind of education that would be required, or what?
No, I mean, the way it's conceptualized in some of this literature is that right, like the pressures of the business environment are obviously you want to diminish how much labor costs, etc. And so your technology has this, maybe you would dispute that it has this direction toward, or like firms will orient technology toward diminishing labor power, right, and reducing labor costs. And as a result, that puts pressure on the educational system to continuously lever up, promote the skills of individuals to compete with technology in the market and protect their position.
But the technology can also be influenced to develop in a way which empowers work, right? So
But it would require state intervention.
Yes, and the state, and it can be in the form of tax incentives and disincentives, or it can be in the form of direct state governmental missions, right? To recreate technology in a certain form, rather than to have the idea that it has an intrinsic dynamic and automatically produces itself. But one of the conditions for the development of this more inclusive knowledge economy is a different kind of education. And the different kind of education depends also on institutional changes. So for example, in the United States, the basis of school finance is local, is municipal. And you can't have national standards of investment in quality if you have a school system that depends on the local property tax. So it requires a change in the character of federalism. All of that. So let's say that's the first stage, right? And this first stage already implies a certain amount of innovation in the relation between public and private. And this partnership of governmental and private producers in the evolution of technology and in this uplift operation. Then you can imagine a second stage in which there begins to emerge a new architecture of the market. There are now in the world two main models of government-business relations. There's the American model of arm's length regulation of business by government. And there's the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. So we would have to imagine a third model of a form of strategic coordination or strategic partnership between government and private producers that was pluralistic, participatory, decentralized, experimentalist. So in other words, instead of just one national trade and industrial policy, a range of competing or alternative policies coexisting experiment in the same market order. And that's vertically in the relation between government and the producers. And horizontally in the relation among the producers, then, cooperative competition, as in 19th century agriculture. So there are different producers, but they cooperate to achieve economies of scale or scope. Now then there's a third stage, far into the future, to describe the direction as a sequence of steps rather than as a blueprint. And as I mentioned before, the direction would, an example of the statement of the direction would be to say, the means of production of society are auctioned off to their most effective users. So there is a permanent auction of the productive resources of society, liquid capital and technology. And the auction is established by funds, independently administered funds, and the democratic institutions set them up and compare the results empirically. They have different risk profiles, they have different time horizons, and so forth. They have different customer client base. So this would then be a radical innovation in private law and in public law at the same time, because you could say property as use and usufruct is being put in these funds, and who owns those resources? No one owns them. You're not transferring the ownership from the private absolute owner to the state, nor to the collective labor force of the firm. Because if you simply take the unified property right and you transfer it, for example, to the workers, then you end up with the pathologies of the Yugoslav model. Some firms will prosper, others will fail. And what then happens? Do you prohibit accumulation and aggregation? And then you enforce a straitjacket, which impoverishes the society. But if you allow it, then the successful firms could buy up the unsuccessful ones. They could then establish two classes of workers, worker owners and wage workers of the unsuccessful firms, and you'd be back to the same system you had before. So the idea is no one owns them. They belong to society that's auctioning them off to their most efficient users. Now, one complication, of course, or refinement, is that according to orthodox finance theory, this is what already happens. That is, in a perfectly competitive financial market is supposed to be the auctioning off of resources to its most efficient users. If they're not most efficient at the start, they'll be the most efficient ones later on. So this was the argument, for example, about spontaneous privatization in Russia. The oligarchs took over like bandits for a song, the resources of the state. And then the economist said it doesn't matter who took them over initially, because eventually they'll end up in the hands of the most efficient users. This was the idea, that this is the auction. So in a sense, this proposal for a capitalism without capitalists is a way of testing this doctrine against reality, and to see whether the results would be the same. So, in other words, there's a trajectory of cumulative transformation involving both public and private law. The peculiar characteristic of legal innovation in the 20th century is that a new body of public law, the law of the regulatory and redistributive state, was superimposed on a largely untransformed body of private law. And here we imagine the simultaneous transformation of both. So in our next meeting, I want to continue this conversation, and then about the reorganization of the economy, the provision of public services, and then the reorganization of democratic politics. So, focusing solely on this idea element, and based on a supposition, which